Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Trying to get some of the technology done here as we get ready for another uh, episode of our lecture series, our speaker series. We welcome each and every one of you. Today is a day that we're going to talk about sort of like one of our own, and that is Alfred Lewis. So again, thank you all. Thank you all for joining. I will try to answer some questions for you if you have them as we go forward. We are also, thanks to all of you who are joining us on Facebook Live as well. I'll be limited as far as looking at all the different technologies and answering some questions, but I hope to give you a comprehensive look at a man who has a quite interesting story. And I'd like to start with, if you'll allow me, with a poem by Alfred Lewis, and it's called My Village in August. As a boy's first drawing, a line of blue hydrangeas facilitates uphill and disappears to join others and be lost under the fog. Ribeira Grande is now a thread of water turning into a veil as it falls way down into a pool circled by black and bushy pines. In the village, the land wedded to corn becomes a shawl of fossils, bending, pregnant with grain. And always a pall of solitude. A sweet and sad feeling touching the young, urging them to leave. Go as others did. Find other rivers, new cities, new mountains, wheat bread, meat, and other things. Nearby, the sea without concern plays on the mobile shore, advancing and retreating under the immutable rules of ever-passing time. Alfred Lewis wrote this in 1967. And we'll talk a little bit about that poem and about some of his writings when it comes to him writing, and as you'll see by the chronology that I'll give of his life, some of the things that happened and how he still has these fond memories of his land. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I hope all of you will be able to see it instead of just looking at me for about a half hour. Much more pleasing to look at a screen. And so I will show you a few slides as I give you this little bit of a talk that I've prepared for you in regards to Alfred Lewis, someone who I have admired for many years. I almost had the chance of meeting him one time when my parents went to a festa in Los Banos. I heard that Mr. Lewis was there at the festa, and I was a teenager, and I tried to find him, a very young teenager, but I was, I believe, 15 years old, but I could not. But anyway, so I missed him, unfortunately, at that time, and I'll tell you why. Obviously, I had a fond, a lot of looked up to him in many, many ways, as his writings kind of shaped me as a young Portuguese American here in the Valley and in California. So the talk is called Alfred Lewis, a Valley writer from the Azores. And we'll start by telling you a little bit about Alfred. So at the age of 19, Alfred Lewis, Alfredo Luis, as he was known, changed his name to Alfred Lewis. Like many other Azorians, leaves his land in search of a better life on American soil. And like other immigrants from the islands of the Azores and many other lands, it was his intention to stay in America for about a half a dozen years, and then, with a little bit of change in his pocket, to return to the beautiful island of Flores, to whom is his beloved Fajanzinha that we see here. We were in the year of 1922 when this Valley writer with Azorian roots crossed the Atlantic and the entire American continent to join his brother, who had lived in Merced County now for 7 years. He had immigrated in 1915. Like many of his countrymen, he, as is said in the Azores, amassou o pão que o diabo não queria amassar, needed the bread that even the devil didn't want to do. First, he went to pick sweet potatoes from sunrise to sunset, which was certainly not the same sunset that years ago he described in an elementary school classroom in his native parish, incentivized by his teacher to take up writing. His early childhood intellectual capacity allowed him to get a perfect score in a national elementary educational test, and later he became a tutor in the island, always with a passion for writing. But as he wrote, and I quote from Alfred Lewis, since you can't have a poem for lunch and bread is still what we need to survive, then he decided to take the same road that his father had also taken, and many others from his island and from all the islands of the Azores, and immigrate to America. Like many of his compatriots, his parents sold a piece of land in order to pay for his passageway. After working in the fields, he decides to move to San Francisco, to the Bay Area, where he became a kitchen helper in at what the time was in 1923 existed a Portuguese restaurant in San Francisco. It always amazes me that San Francisco had a Portuguese restaurant in 1923. It has one today, but many others areas throughout our valley, unfortunately, don't have Portuguese restaurants, and we have a much bigger Portuguese American population. The longing, or in Portuguese, that wonderful word, saudade, for his island, that longing that immigrants live with daily, especially in the early days of residence in a distant land, led him to write an article for a newspaper called, at that time, Jornal de Notícias, whose editor was a fellow countryman from his island of Flores, Pedro L. C. Silveira. It was this article that led him to be invited to work for the Revista Portuguesa, edited by João Simas de Melo, an immigrant from the island of Pico. This would be the beginning of an intimate connection with Portuguese journalism in California. He learned typography and, for a while, was the sole person responsible for the publication of Revista Portuguesa. Then an invitation from one of the pioneers in Portuguese media in California, in press and in broadcast media, Arthur Avila, who was originally born, actually, right as soon as he arrived from Pico. His mother was coming from Terceira on a boat to meet his father, who had been stationed in Pico, was a government worker, and he was born in Pico, and parents from Pico and Terceira. Anyway, he took him, so Arthur Avila took him to Tulare, the city where I live, where he worked on the Portuguese newspaper O Lavrador Português, the Portuguese farmer. After the newspaper closed, he returned to Merced area, living in Atwater, where he got a job as a clerk in a retail store. It was in Atwater that he became very ill. He was diagnosed with tuberculosis. He was interned into a sanatorium. While in the sanatorium, he read ferociously. He cites the magazine American Mercury and the works that he read in the magazine by John dos Passos, Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, among others, as people who really, really influenced him and influenced his writings. Donald Warren, who published a collection of Lewis's poetry in 1986, a wonderful book, in his very well-written and enlightening introduction, references some other writers that Lewis read widely and also influenced him throughout the years: Keats, Kipling, Stephen Cranes, Willa Cather, Sherwood Anderson, Theodore Dreiser, Whitman, of course, Sandburg, and Frost. And so there was lots of different influences, and he read tremendously. And basically, when he was interned because of the tuberculosis, that was kind of his English classes. There is some anecdotal information that says that he was actually cured at the end of a few weeks, but that the doctor kept him there an additional few weeks and told him, hey, you could have gone home a few weeks ago, but you were doing so well, and this was kind of your English classroom. So in 1930, after he after he left the hospital, Lewis was very upset because his brother, with whom he had joined in 1922, never visited him while he was hospitalized. So he accepts an invitation from some friends to move to Los Banos, that you see here, the city that he lived until he died on June the 10th of 1977. Quite interesting is that June the 10th is, as all of you know, or some of you might know, is Portugal Day, Dia de Portugal, de Camões, and then later on, after the revolution of 1974, also Dia das Comunidades Portuguesas, of the Portuguese communities abroad. In Los Banos, he married a young lady of Italian ancestry, Rose. They had a daughter, Suzanne. In this valley town, he works at a lawyer's office. He becomes a notary public. He also becomes a real estate salesperson. He then becomes an insurance salesman, an accountant. He studies law and becomes a municipal judge, a position that, interestingly enough, he resigns after serving for about 9 years. According to Professor Warren in the aforementioned essay, Lewis disagrees with the city council decision to install parking meters on the downtown area, and he refuses to enforce any ticket given by the police. And so he resigns from his judicial post. It is worth quoting Lewis's very brief autobiography and his commitment to the community, especially, of course, the Portuguese American community that he so cherished. And he writes in his very brief autobiography that's included in a couple of his books, and I quote, "The most important thing to me is that I became a sort of advisor to hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of Portuguese immigrants that resided in the San Joaquin Valley. It pleased me to write letters for them, to fill out forms, various forms that they didn't understand, or to write out their checks. All of this without any monetary compensation. I try in every way I can to make these people's experiences in America when they come here to live and to work as pleasant as possible," end quote. A little bit about Alfred Lewis's writings, and like Joseph Conrad, basically our Alfredo Luís, now Alfred Lewis, he always wrote under Alfred Lewis and not Alfred Luís, starts publishing in his new and adopted language. He published immensely, mostly in English. He has some things in Portuguese. From short stories in the magazine that I mentioned here, The Prairie, poetry in the Carmel Pine Cone, to circumstantial articles that he wrote for the newspapers that existed at the time in Los Banos and in Dos Palos. Our Florentine immigrant is already aware that through writing, he is building community, and the importance of having our community, this is in the 1930s and 1940s, to have our community with its own voice, and for our community to have its voice in the American mainstream press. He said he said this himself about the publication of Home is an Island, which was his book that made him most famous in the American world, in which I quote, "I believe that this book, although in a modest way, served to make the Azorean people know to many here in the United States who only know our community through the reference Melville made to the Azorean whaler in his immortal Moby Dick," end quote. Lewis basically tells us that one day a friend told him about a writers' conference in Boulder, Colorado. So in 1950, Lewis takes the long journey from Los Banos to Colorado. Cars were different, transportation methods were different, obviously, roads were different. There he was able to meet a variety of writers, and as he tells us, and I quote, "After they looked at what I had taken, poetry and fiction, they encouraged me to continue writing," end quote. He returned home convinced that he would indeed write a novel. A few months later, he had completed the manuscript to Home as an Island that you see here, that he said was, and I quote again, my first serious book. He sent it off to Professor Alan Seeger of the English department at the University of Michigan, whom he had met at that writers' conference in Colorado. According to Lewis, along with the manuscript, he wrote the following notes, and I quote again, "This is a sort of exercise in fiction. Do you mind, as a writer, giving me your thoughts?" End quote. To Lewis's surprise, a few weeks later, he received a telegraph saying that he had taken the liberty, the professor, Alan Seeger, had taken the liberty to send it to his agent in New York, and he had submitted the novel, the agent had submitted the novel to Random House. It took the prestigious publishing house 4 days to decide, according to Professor Alan Seeger, that they would indeed publish Home is an Island. So basically, in 1951, almost 70 years ago, this Azorean immigrant who had left his home with a 4th grade education at the age of 19, who had taught himself English by reading some of the best writers of the English language, now at the age of 49 years old, with a wealth of experiences, saw his novel published by one of the major publishing houses in the country at the time, still today, and with an array of very positive reviews. The writer Patricia Highsmith wrote, and best known for her psychological thrillers, wrote, and I quote, "One does not often find a novel that reads like a poem, that tells a simple story in a simple prose, and yet is heroic. It is a novel of importance," end quote. The New York Times Book Review said, "Lewis's style and quality of narrative is most refreshing. Some of his descriptive passages, in very ways very simple, but very rich in imagery, ring with lyricism of poetry," end quote. And the Library Journal affirmed, and I quote again, "There is about this novel a fine, tender, sensitive spiritual quality, a quietness and repose in keeping with the simple, honest, and straightforward lives of villagers." And for selling purposes, what better phrase than the one from the Chicago Sunday Tribune? It is the kind of book that is a delight to read. So with all of that, obviously, Home is an Island probably didn't become the #1 seller in the United States, but gave him indeed the prestige that up until then, very few Portuguese writers, or actually no writer from the Azores that had immigrated had such a break. Home is an Island is indeed a very autobiographical book. And I've always read this book as a symbiotic relationship between two cultures. What Vitorino Mezio coined as Azorianness, Azurinidade, or Azorianality. Some people have done it, translated that way. And to continue with that terminology, Californianness or Californianality, because it is very specific to the Azorean culture, and it is very specific to rural California and even the suburbs of California of the 1950s. The book centers on life in the Azores. It doesn't talk about it here, but if you read, and I'm sure many of you have read Home is an Island, when you read it, he talks about, coming to this place, like he had been at this place. So the book centers on life in the Azores, the island of Flores, while concentrating on the American dream through the Californian experience. As Portuguese scholar Maria Filipa Palma dos Reis suggests in her essay, including the book Alfred Lewis, Escritor de Emoções, what Alfred Lewis really does is, as I was saying, is basically at the beginning of the decade, the book was published in 1951, with Home as an Island, is to initiate and maintain a constant dialogue between his culture of origin and the culture of the country that welcomed him where he was hoping to get to. Some of the traditional human values that built it in the past. And so that is from Professor Palma Reis. The connection that Lewis makes about America and California by writing about the life in the Azores are indicative of the connections that the Azorians have always had with America. The America that opens its arms to immigrants, all immigrants, including those from what, even in 1951, when the book was published, much less when Alfred Lewis left in 1922, was still a very poor archipelago. The idea of America present in the Azores, as we are told in the book, and I quote from Home is an Island. His father spoke of that fabulous country called America. In those days, America was only a name, a very pleasant one to be sure. It meant that perhaps on the other side of the sea, there existed a land where all little boys had lots of candy to eat, where coffee and sugar were always plentiful. For those of you who lived in the Azores, especially in the 1920s, obviously, but even in the 1950s and 60s, coffee with sugar was a luxury at many times. I still have fond memories of coffee with milk and sugar, lots of it during the matanças. And so as Professor Filipe dos Reis wrote, and I quote, so the America that for José, the adolescent is gold, for José the criança, the kid, was candy, which means that as much as it is equated with the acquisition of material goods, America is in fact, in this community, the projection of each one's dreams. It is something to be looked for by poets, end quote. I would add that Alfred Lewis projects in this novel a sense of an America and a California with boundless opportunities that was part of the everyday experience of the lives of the Azorians in much of the 20th century. The American cousins, the Californians, or as we call them, Californas, as they were known and still in some parts are, were distant family. They were distant family, but only in geography, for they always had a place at the Azorian table and a permanent spot in the Azorian heart. Besides, Home is an Island, with its new edition, recently published by Tegas Press from the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. So if you have not read it, I would highly recommend it. And it's a book that you really folks would enjoy it, and as some of the critics did as well. There are other stories that he wrote, and I would think that Home is an Island, and even the next one that I'll talk about very briefly, when we talk about Portuguese American ethnic studies courses, it indeed needs to be required reading. But Lewis also wrote other novels, one also published by Tegas Press, 60 Acres in the Barn. And this is a story of an Azorian Californian experience, so right on this side of the Atlantic. In this story, we are faced with the dilemmas of the recently arrived and the adjustment to a new land, adopting as well to the other Portuguese Americans that were already living here. So it's a book of acculturation and also a little bit of the tension that at times existed between those recently arrived and those who had been here for a while, a long time, and especially those who were born in California, but whose parents had immigrated from the Azores. A tension that exists between many ethnicities, not just the Portuguese, but let me just break, if I can, to tell you a little bit of an anecdotal situation that happened to me. I came to this country in 1968. I was 10 years old. And I recall I was in the fourth grade at a rural school here in Tulare. Some of you who are from this area might know the school, Paulo Verde School. It was a very Portuguese school because there were lots of dairy farms in that area. And so just that week, there was like 5 of us that had arrived from the Azores, and there were probably, it was a small school, but there were probably another 10 or 15 that had arrived recently as well. And others who had been here longer than that. And I recall one time I was playing out during recess, and I started playing with a couple of kids, and one of them told me, "You can't come over here." And I knew he was Portuguese, and I understood English badly. I had been here maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, and I said, "Why not?" And he says, "This is not for you. You're not one of us." And I knew all the other kids, and I said, "But I'm Portuguese." He said, "No, you're not. You're a Portuguese." And I said, "Excuse me?" That was the first time I had heard that word. And I said, "What do you mean?" And I recall distinctively, he said, "No, no, no. My dad owns the cows, so we're Portuguese. Your dad is the milker, so you're the Portuguese." So, this tension existed, and obviously this was kids, but sometimes kids get things from other people, and obviously the novel doesn't go into detail this, but it talks a little bit about this tension. So Lewis also wrote other unpublished books. The Land Is Here, which is a sort of continuation of Home is an Island. He also wrote Rockville, California, which was a science fiction work. The Mark of the Trespasser, which is a story about an immigrant family from Mexico. And A Ship Full of Corn, in which the author returns to write about the Azores. These have never been published. Lewis is also the author of hundreds of poems. For those who came from the Azores in the 1960s, as I mentioned, as I did, we grew up basically with Alfred Lewis. And we grew up reading the poetry of Alfred Lewis in the pages of the newspaper Jornal Português from São Paulo. The Lewis wrote extensively for the Jornal Português, and with every single edition of this weekly newspaper, there was something from Lewis. We were used to his truly bilingual qualities, for he would publish in Portuguese and also in English with the same easiness, mostly in Portuguese in the Jornal Português. Much of the poetry and the prose that I read in the pages of the Jornal Português in my teen years from Lewis is masterfully described in an essay that poet Eduardo Betancourt Pinto. The essay is also included in the book I mentioned, Alfred Lewis, Writer of Emotions, and it's called The Last Look at Saudade. And I quote from Eduardo Betancourt Pinto. "Paradise lost and unrecoverable, Alfred Lewis's island bequeath us, through his rhythm, a poetry of the imponderable. To flee, to hide, to ignore the island experience would be to deny the face, the past, the dead, the names that continued in their sensitivity alive and eternal, even if only possible in the infinite paroxysm of the spirits. The search for the essential, unfortunately so dispersed in the thousand faces of human anxiety, also wants to balance the balance of harmony and the genetic Eden that is gone from us forever." Never having returned to the islands of the Azores, to his enchanting Flores, truly a beautiful island, Alfred Lewis, like many other immigrants of that generation, kept the island of their childhood with them intact. In Lewis's poetry and prose, especially when it comes to the islands, there's an attempt to recuperate emotionally everything that was left behind, to recreate the world that one left in order to live the present and construct the future. That has been the story of the immigrant experience that Alfred Lewis masterfully conjugates. And as the literary critic Vamberto Freitas wrote in that same book, and I quote, "The poetry of a soul divided by the past and present, by two national realities, by two languages, and two ways of thinking and being, which Lewis apparently embraced without complexes and tried once again to balance the arts and intelligence, everything that encompasses, everything that is an intimate part of this complex human experience, the immigrant experience in any society. End quote. Alfred Lewis, indeed, has left us a legacy of poetry and prose that invokes the constant presence of one's homeland and elevates, truly elevates, the immigrant experience to what I believe is a very noble undertaking. And so that is a little bit about my talk, but I wanted to share with you to prove some of the things that I've said in one way or another, a little bit of from Alfred Lewis and Home is an Island. Just share with you one small passage that I believe is important to basically kind of get the idea of what the book is all about. And this is towards the end of the book, and it's and I will read from the Home is an Island. Documents, stamps, fees, nothing was wanting. The days were moving rapidly towards that date with destiny. He avoided his mother's eyes as much as possible, sensing her deep, consuming sorrow. He knew she would soon start talking. She would start talking a lot, yes, as she did always when overcome with emotion. His father remained silent. He had done much, by indirect persuasion, of course, to direct him toward the land at the far end of the horizon. Let me pause by telling you that one time Pedro de Silveira, a poet from the island of Flores as well, who also respected Alfred Lewis a lot. Pedro is one of our best poets from the Azores and one of the best poets in the Portuguese language, as far as I'm concerned. And Pedro told me one time of how the older generation, to basically exemplify what is said here at the end of the horizon, how the older generation, when they saw the boats, Flores is the most western island in the archipelago of the Azores, and so when they saw at a distance the little lights from the boats, they would say, "Hey, lights are on in America." Because indeed, Flores is the closest to the American continent, the most western point of the archipelago of the Azores. And so he knew that under that enforced calm, José regretted leaving. The father, too, would know the silence of an empty home. The days moving by in mute succession, the same sunshine and silences, the same sound, and that invariable blue above the hills. Oh, there would be deaths, weddings, and births now and then, but even these events would always be very much like any others. For quite a few years now, the island and the village had been losing their population little by little. It was a natural thing. Of those who left, many did not return. Young girls were left waiting, walking to the high cliffs above the harbor once a month to wait for lovers and husbands, nearly always in vain. His mother, too, would soon watch the steamer every month, hoping and counting the days. The day before his departure, he took an inventory of the things he had, the writings, the clippings, and the notes, to be gathered together and be taken away as mementos of the past. He sat on the bed as he used to, and now he felt this was the best bedroom in all the world. The mattress filled with dry, aromatic moss, the softest. He opened the window and let the wonderful cool air in, charged with 100 pungent, well-known odors. Sitting there, he read his first attempt at poetry and smiled at its weakness of form. Yet this was very important to him. It represented a first step toward a way of expression, the birth of an urge. There were other things, his diploma, his school diploma, and a gold engraved certificate recording his first communion. He placed these things carefully in a cloth sack sewn by his mother for this purpose. He examined his clothes carefully, his shoes, and tried to knot his tie. the only one he had, a gift from America. The knot was very hard to manage, but after a while, he was able to do it. After a fashion, tie clean clothes and shoes, he would have to become accustomed to the style of the new world. And so that is from Home is an Island by Alfred Lewis. There are lots of his poems that I could read for you to kind of give you some examples of what we are saying. But as I was saying, we have. Let's stop sharing here. But I don't want to continue forever with you. So I am just going to take a little bit more time to mention a couple of other things and to end basically this talk about Alfred Lewis, talking to you about one of his fellow poets, and that is Gabriela Silva, who has done a remarkable job in the Azores and in the island of Flores with the poets from that island, especially with Pedro de Silveira and also with Alfred Lewis. And to commemorate the 100th birthday of Alfred Lewis back in 2002, the poets Gabriela Silva wrote this poem called Para Alfredo Luís, for Alfred Lewis, that I translated to English for you. And it is basically kind of a story of Alfred as not just Alfred Lewis, but also representing a generation of folks, whether they be from Flores or from any other island or different parts of mainland Portugal and Madeira as well, and as they move on to other parts of the world. And so Alfred Lewis, the poem Para Alfred Luís, for Alfred Lewis. You had in your eyes the desire to escape, to leave. When you looked at Pico Redondo from a distance, you learned of other worlds, other lives, other people. Could be waiting on the edge of the other side, that craving for infinity. You let just like someone who will be back in no time. As if there were no pain and no farewell, without a shout, without a cry, without a word. You took some breads and expectation in your empty hands. But without fear you left, looking ahead, shivering the way like someone who feels that looking back is not possible without backing down. And you didn't want to. Or maybe you wanted to, but you didn't even know it. You knew the sea and the distance, the absence of fears, the greatness of hope, and you were absolutely sure that in Pico Redondo, a Feijãozinha, everything would be motionless. Sadly, the same forever. And if one day you returned, all would still be there, every day. The same sunsets from your childhood, the same green passive rock in front of you. Go, Alfredo, go, for America is your destiny. Go, Alfredo, triumph in the distance. Longing will rot your childhood soul, but go. Linguiça and inhames still have the same smell and the taste of that time. And pigs are still killed at Christmas time with the same rituals. That ongoing routine, the slow death of our intact island. And the festa, always the festa of Senhora dos Remédios. We continue to ask, asking and paying in a game of give and take, a payment for dreams of departures without returns, a payment for dreams of returning without leaving, of asking for secret and definitive departures without fear and quickly, a request for returns that have never left. From Pico Redondo, from your home, we always see the same sea, the sea that took you one day forever, the homesickness sea that still awaits, oh, that fool, for a return. That is from Gabriela Silva from the island of Flores, dedicated to Alfredo Luis. And with that, I conclude this talk about Alfred Lewis, an Azorean writer here in the Valley, or a Valley writer from the Azores, whose work is immensely related, obviously, to the Portuguese-American experience in California, and certainly from the islands of the Azores. Highly recommend Home as an Island and 60 Acres in the Barn, and highly recommend as well the book of poems, Poesias, by Alfred Lewis, with an introduction and basically organized by Professor Donald Warren. Unfortunately, it'd be probably hard to find it. It was something that it would be very interesting to see a new edition of this. There are poems in Portuguese, most of them in Portuguese, but there are some in English as well. So it is Alfred Lewis tells the story in many different ways, whether it be in Home in an Island, whether it be in 60 Acres in a Barn, whether it be through his poetry of the Portuguese-American experience, of the life of those who once left their beautiful islands and reconstructed their world the best way they could here in California. He is indeed a Californian writer. I would say a Valley writer, very, very in tune to the Valley, to the ruralness of the Valley, but also to the small suburb areas that were popped up, especially since the 1950s and 60s. And it is amazing how Alfred Lewis, with some of his poetry, when I first started to read him in the, for sure, in early 1970s, I would say 72, 73, I was probably about 13, 14 years old. I was always, struck by how these things, and I had been here for 5 years, so it was like I was in the Azores, and some of these poems, some of the ones that I was reading to you, and My Village in August, for example, that I opened up, was a poem he wrote in 1967. That was 45 years after he left the islands of the Azores, that he, as I said, never returned. So the presence of those islands and the presence of his Flores, which is a very mystical and mythical island, a beautiful island with beautiful people. The island of Flores was present with him. And as I mentioned, he reconstructed it basically in his prose and his poetry as a way to survive in the new world. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for being part of our lecture series. Brought to you by the Fundação Luso-Americana para o Desenvolvimento, FLAD, and also, of course, organized by the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at California State University of Fresno. A little bit of information, and that is starting on the 26th of September, so coming up very, very soon. We will be featuring the Luso-American Education Foundation Conference. The conference and the program has already been put out in public. The first sessions will be on Saturday morning, the 26th at 10 o'clock, with the presence of the Secretary of State for Portuguese Communities. And there will be a general session, an inaugural section, that is moderated by Professor Duarte Silva, a professor emeritus from Stanford University, about the Portuguese language as a global language. And then we will have another session on Sunday morning. And then throughout the week, sessions will be at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, in the evening, and culminating on October 3rd at 10 a.m. That's our next event for the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at California State University, Fresno, the organization of an 8-day conference of the Luso-American Education Foundation with a reflection on the Portuguese American community in California during these unprecedented times. Our regular lectures will continue, and the next one will be on the 14th. On the 14th of October, we will have a panel of 6 young fadistas from the state of California who will talk about how they became involved with Fado and how they see Fado today and in the future in California. It is our way to commemorate the 100th birthday of Amália Rodrigues. Once again, thank you so much, and hope all of you have a great evening, and send me any comments, any suggestions for any upcoming lectures. I'm always willing to listen as we start now, basically promoting the events for the rest of this semester, but we are starting to plan the events for the semester of 2021. Take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time on these webinars put forth by the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, which is a product of 3 colleges: College of Arts and Humanities, the Jordan College of Agricultural Science and Technology, and the College of Social Science at California State University, Fresno. Take care. Thank you so much.